Welcome to Brighter Futures, the film series about how research can change policy and improve lives. I'm delighted to welcome Tracey Loughran from the Department of History at the University of Essex. In this episode, we're talking about public engagement with history and how this can be used to empower and improve the lives of young people. Tracey, you've studied how women's lives have changed over the past 70 or so years, enormous amount. Tell us a bit about this and how that led to the development of a toolkit.
Okay, so I was working on a project about women's everyday health between the 1960s and the 1990s, and I was really fortunate to work on that project with Dr. Payling and Dr. Mahoney, both superb researchers. What we were really interested in is how women's lives changed from the ground up. So a lot of the time when you read histories about this sort of area, it's very top-down, it's what doctors thought, it's government policy. And we were interested in both speaking to ordinary women, though nobody's that ordinary once you start talking to them, and also looking at the kinds of things they were interacting with in their everyday lives, like magazines, say mass market magazines that we normally think of as things that are read on the bus or in the doctor's surgery and thrown away, but actually sold millions of copies and were read by millions and millions of people every week. So as we were working through these sources, we were kind of really struck by the variety and richness of women's lives, how much had changed between then and now, but also how much these women had to say about reflecting back on what had happened to them. And so we thought it would be useful to try to set up a slightly different link between these women talking about their own pasts and young people now and how they might prepare for their futures using those sorts of memories.
So you've called the outcome of this a study of bodies, hearts and minds, and how that has changed over time and how thinking about that now and using those historical sources can help people. Could give us a couple of examples. The agony aunt one, the work on period products, for example, have been a real kind of opening of people's eyes, haven't they?
Yeah, so there's a section in the toolkit on growing up, and there are a few exercises in that around young girls' experiences of periods, and particularly period poverty. And this arose out of a set of events that Kate organised in conjunction with the Being Human Festival, which was really designed to raise awareness of period poverty. It included a couple of events at the University of Essex, also an exhibition at the Beecroft Gallery, but one of the things we did was work with girl guiding groups. So we went in and gave some talks about periods in the past and how they'd changed, and asked the girl guiding groups to design their own posters to raise awareness of period poverty, and then to use the hashtag Seeing Red on social media to publicise these. And it was a really great experience. It was entirely led by Kate, but I helped out with the workshops. And it was fantastic to see these young people kind of talking quite openly about some of their experiences because they were in a situation where there wasn't this pressure, where they were working closely in groups with friends, and they were, using craft materials. They were covered in glitter by the end of it. And it created a really nice, fun way of thinking about a topic that can be quite painful and embarrassing for people usually.
So some of those topics have had kind of heavy stigmas associated with them, and yet through this sort of participatory engagement that created the space for people to talk about things in a new way and then perhaps lead to change, to some sort of social action. So what happened when the young girls, the students, the guides, the others were able to start talking about things that they hadn't had the chance to do so in the past?
Well, I think one of the things that we realised was that young girls might often talk to their immediate friendship groups, but they don't necessarily talk on a class level or on a bigger group level. And simply by naming something that's stigmatised and making it public, you're encouraging people to understand that there's nothing really shameful about it. And I think we've had some really positive feedback from guide leaders since. I think those events were probably about 3 years ago, and they say that some of the people involved still talk about them now. Also, though, we found that we were challenging our own assumptions in running the workshops. We had thought about things like, that it's not a good idea to use euphemisms for periods, but actually for lots of the girls, they would describe the euphemisms that they used, they would laugh about them, and it was another way of talking more easily, and in the end that's what really counts.
And so you worked with Kate and Daisy with lots of different local organisations to assess the historical information that, as you said earlier, often isn't seen as historical. The Agony Aunt from Jackie magazine, for example, using that information. And this helped them see the world differently, talk about their own bodies and identity differently. Did you and colleagues see changes in them as this was happening?
Most of the activities we did were only really one-offs with groups, and partly that's because of the pandemic. We were running these activities mainly in 2018, 2019, and we had evaluation activities planned to go back and do them face-to-face, and obviously that didn't happen. And basically by the time we'd got to a point where we could have been in a room with lots of people maskless and it would have been okay, the project funding had run out, which was a shame. But what we did do was email, ask follow-up questions, and we were also really fortunate in that the young mental health ambassadors at Healthwatch Essex agreed to trial the toolkit for us and provide feedback. So, as with many things in the past few years, what we'd wanted to do with this didn't quite work out as we'd hoped, but we're treating the launch of the toolkit itself as a new phase where we can run those activities with groups, go back, see how they work, and add more resources to our website as we get feedback on what works, and well, hopefully everything works, but everything can also always be better.
Yes, and that kind of natural adjustment that has to occur in the process of trying to research things, but also make them relevant. If you went up a level then, as you said, some of this is being taken forward by Healthwatch Essex across the county, which is kind of getting the findings of the research into policy. I mean, it might not be national policy yet, but it's certainly local and regional, changing the way that professionals see the world. Could you just tell us a little bit about how you see some of the findings kind of elevating into the policy space?
What I would really like to see happen is an awareness of adolescence as a time of vulnerability. Certain groups of adolescents are obviously more vulnerable than others, but for all adolescents, it's a time when their bodies are changing, their relationships are changing with the people around them as they try to make their way in the adult world. And one of the things that history can do is show that to a certain extent that's always been the same. People have faced different pressures, people have reached adulthood at earlier stages. You know, when the school leaving age was 14 or 15, I think people felt a very different sense of how their life should be moving on in their later teens. But at the same time, it's always a period of awkwardness and exploration, and one in which maybe one of the best things we can do is give young people a bit of space to breathe and to be themselves and to find themselves and discover who they want to be.
So could you just tell us a little bit then about how you see the role of public history in this sense, public engagement in history, how that can be used to make these kinds of changes, both at the individual level but also at the social and policy level?
Well, I think often people don't think about history in this way. People are much more engaged with history now than they were 10 or 15 years ago. You know, BBC History magazine sells loads of copies. There are lots of popular history TV programmes. And it's just really different, those conversations you have with hairdressers or people. You know, 10 years ago people say, oh, I hated that at school. And now they often say, oh, I love history. So people do increasingly understand and enjoy history. What they often don't think about is the way it can be applied to understanding the world around us now. And yet, if you think about it on an individual level, when we try to make sense of our own lives and where we are, we'll often start with thinking about, you know, how we grew up, the people around us, what happened to us. And trying to use history to understand the world on a broader scale is exactly the same thing. We're thinking about how, you know, our social group has been treated, what's happened to that group, how legislation's changed, how people have become more confident as a result of that. So if you have that kind of historical mindset where you think it can be applied to the present, there are all kinds of ways in which you can introduce a historical perspective into pretty much anything people might do. In terms of shaping policy, I think one of the most important things is for people who make policy at whatever level, simply to have a sense that there is a past. You know, it's very easy when you're sitting around a table drawing up plans to get excited about the next new thing and to feel like you're reinventing the wheel. And I know I've certainly done that myself several times. But it's also really important to think about what people might have done in the past and to bring that experience to bear on shaping what you're doing in the future.
And the past is not about events and big kind of notable times in the calendar. It's about the way that our interactions change, the way that people's life course changes, the kind of the more subtle things. I mean, we've moved a long way from just saying, well, we need to remember these dates and work out. That's what history is about. Actually, it's about the changes that people are able to go through, but also have agency to help make those changes. I mean, that was something that you saw with the young people as part of the toolkit, is that they engaged with something and then they felt they should take action about it. That was quite interesting.
Yeah, lots of them were quite inspired by the fact that they'd known that there was stigma around periods. They hadn't realised the extent of the stigma still, or the extent of period poverty today. And so one of the guide groups, for example, set up a collection box for menstrual products, which was just a fantastic thing to have had. And it's small scale, but this is how change works. It's individual people trying to do things to change the world around them, and that ripples out.
Exactly. And so if we're thinking about public history in this kind of way, what would you say are the next priorities from your side in terms of the way that research can inform policy? What would be the 2 or 3 kind of headlines that from your perspective and what you've been looking at, particularly with the changing lives of women across the last century?
I'd like to see more historicised thinking. I would really like to see things like national policy on women's health taking into account the really long and ingrained sense of gender disparity in how women's bodies have been treated and viewed. Partly because if you think about how any medical encounter works, the doctor dealing with a person will have been trained by somebody who was probably trained 20 or 30 years earlier, and so on and so forth. So those kind of relics of past ages often filter down in very, very subtle ways. And I think when you talk to women now about their medical encounters, they often still feel that they're not taken as seriously because of their gender. And there are all kinds of statistics on this. You know, there are quite notable problems with certain diagnostic apps which will tell a man he's having a heart attack, but a woman with the same symptoms that she's having a panic attack. So those kinds of issues can actually really threaten lives in the end. And if we were a bit more aware of the fact that it's not just us as women in this moment having a problem with this individual doctor, but there is a whole structural problem going back centuries that I suspect the doctors aren't aware of either, that might help to shift some thinking. It might help to make us all a bit aware of how we handle those encounters from both sides. Excellent.
Tracey Loughran, thank you very much indeed. Many thanks. You've been watching a Brighter Futures film short. For more conversations on how ideas improve lives, pop over to our sister podcast, Louder Than Words.